A neighbor called the police when he saw a woman in a red Ferrari. He was sure that such a car couldn't belong to a woman, and certainly not in this neighborhood. A couple of minutes later, the officers were already handcuffing her. But everything changed when she stood up. It was Ronda Rousey. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The heat of the Southern California sun clung to the pavement like memory, thick and golden, radiating from every polished surface. At the far end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with eucalyptus and silent glass-paneled homes, a low growl echoed off stucco walls and manicured hedges. The sound came not from violence, but from precision, a well-tuned engine, restrained and exact. A flash of scarlet slipped past a gate of wrought iron and into the stillness of the neighborhood like a drop of blood on linen. The Ferrari 488 Spider coasted along the wide private street before coming to a stop at one of the newer homes, a place of clean lines and quiet power. Its walls were bone white, its windows tall and shaded, and its driveway gleamed like a welcome mat for someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. Ronda Rousey shut off the ignition and paused for a moment. The engine ticked gently as it cooled, and the car's leather interior held the scent of summer and control. She sat still, one hand resting on the gear selector, the other on her thigh. Her face was calm, unreadable. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, only black athletic gear, a zippered jacket, and gray running shoes. Her hair was tied back, her sunglasses mirrored, and the lines at the corners of her eyes weren't from age, but from squinting into the light of scrutiny for too many years. She stepped out of the car and closed the door with a quiet thud. The sound was oddly intimate in the silence. No barking dogs, no shouting children. Just cicadas, the hum of far-off air conditioners, and the vague whisper of the ocean down the canyon. This was her new home, a place bought without fanfare, without press, a property tucked just far enough from the chaos of LA to pretend peace was possible. She hadn't come here to impress anyone. She'd come here to be left alone. She circled the car, opened the trunk, and began removing a few bags. There was nothing lavish in her movements. Everything she did was deliberate, quiet, efficient. A woman alone, unbothered, in control. Across the street, a man stood on his porch. He was still as a statue, hands behind his back, wearing pressed khaki slacks, a light blue button-down shirt, and a navy baseball cap. The American flag on a pole behind him hung limp in the absence of wind. His skin was tanned, creased from sun and age, and his eyes, hidden behind reflective sunglasses, tracked her every step. Ronda noticed him without turning her head. It was instinct. She always knew when she was being watched, but she gave no indication. She moved up the stone steps of her entryway, keyed in her security code, and slipped inside without a backward glance. Later, as dusk softened the hard edges of the neighborhood and shadows stretched long across the lawns, Ronda stood barefoot in her new kitchen, sipping from a glass of water. The interior was quiet, open, minimal furniture, a sleek counter of matte black granite. No trophies, no photos. The air smelled of wood oil and rosemary. From the corner of her eye, she saw him again. The man across the street. He hadn't moved. Still on the porch. Still watching. She didn't react. Not visibly. But she noted it. Logged it. Cataloged the way he stood, the lack of phone in his hand, the military stiffness in his spine. Not curious, not neighborly, evaluating, judging. His name, she would learn the following week, was Thomas Randy, retired federal agent, widower, no children. A man whose opinions arrived fully formed and never wavered. A man who believed he was still in charge of something. By the third day, the pattern became harder to ignore. Each time she returned in the Ferrari, she would catch a glimpse of him, through blinds, over a hedge, standing beside his mailbox, pretending to organize junk mail that never changed. Once, he circled her car slowly, as if appraising a suspect. Another time, he took a photo with his phone while pretending to check his watch. She said nothing, but she noticed. That weekend, she took a longer drive up the coast. She returned just before sunset, the Ferrari humming up the steep incline to her driveway. As she exited the vehicle, she saw him again, this time standing much closer, on the sidewalk just beyond the hedge. His phone was raised, his face expressionless. She stood by the trunk, motionless, keys in hand. She didn't challenge him, didn't gesture. She just waited until he lowered the device and turned away. The next day, an envelope arrived, not in the mailbox but taped to her door. Reminder, per HOA Regulation 4B, extended street parking is not permitted. All vehicles must be parked in designated private spaces. Repeat violations may result in fines. Her car had been parked in her own driveway. The letter had no signature, no HOA seal, but she understood the message. Later that evening, a delivery man stopped her as she signed for a package. "Hey," he said awkwardly, glancing toward the house across the street. "Heads up. That guy? Kinda weird. He took a picture of my truck last week and asked who I was delivering to. I told him to mind his business, but just saying." Rhonda nodded once, then closed the door behind her. She didn't need warnings. She had seen men like Thomas Randy all her life. Men who looked at women and only saw threats if they didn't smile, didn't obey, didn't explain. Men who demanded respect without offering it, who mistook silence for invitation, who patrolled borders that didn't belong to them. She could have reported him, filed a complaint, but she wasn't ready for escalation, not yet. She still believed in restraint, even if restraint didn't believe in her. That night, she walked her property perimeter barefoot under the stars, her Akita trotting beside her. The wind rustled the hedges. The hills breathed slowly in the dark. From across the street, she saw a faint flicker of light movement behind closed blinds. Watching, always watching. In the morning, she opened her front door to find another envelope. This time inside the mailbox, folded crisply. Residents are encouraged to report unfamiliar vehicles or individuals exhibiting suspicious behavior. Security is a shared responsibility. Still unsigned, still anonymous, still clearly meant for her. She sighed, not out of fear or frustration, but weariness, the kind of exhaustion that lived not in muscles or bones, but in the soul. The exhaustion of having to explain, again and again, that she belonged, that she didn't owe anyone proof. That day, she left the Ferrari parked right out front, not out of pride, not to provoke, but to remind herself that she didn't have to shrink. He passed by twice that afternoon, once on foot, once in a golf cart, slow and deliberate, head turned toward her house. She didn't move, didn't smile, didn't wave. Inside, she resumed her training. Resistance bands, controlled breath, stillness between tension, the language of discipline. At dusk, she sat by the edge of her infinity pool, water untouched, legs folded beneath her. Her dog lay at her feet. The horizon burned orange. And across the street, behind thick curtains, a man waited, watching, preparing. He didn't yet know what he was preparing for. But she did. Morning came with its usual calm, the light spilling in through the tall windows like a lazy tide, slow and warm. Rhonda stood in her kitchen, stirring a protein shake, her bare feet pressing into the cool stone floor. Outside, the neighborhood shimmered in quiet perfection. Manicured lawns, precisely trimmed hedges, and the faint rustle of sprinklers across concrete edges. It was designed piece artificial, curated and fragile. She sipped slowly, letting the stillness settle into her chest, pretending for a moment that it was real. But peace in places like this was never unconditional. It always came with rules, with glances, with threshold too easily crossed by the wrong kind of presence. She first noticed the shift during her third morning jog. As she rounded the bend near the tennis courts, a woman with a stroller glanced up and paused, just a second too long. Then as Rhonda approached, the woman gripped the stroller tighter and stepped aside, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. No greeting, no smile, just silence wrapped in discomfort. Later that day, while unloading groceries from the Ferrari, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with an older couple from 3 houses down. The woman's eyes darted to the car, then back to Rhonda's face. The man gave a polite nod, but the stiffness in his posture gave him away. "Lovely car," he said, but it didn't sound like a compliment. "Is it leased?" the woman added, half smiling. The kind of smile that knew exactly what it was doing. Rhonda answered with silence. She had nothing to explain. They walked on. The letters began arriving more frequently, tucked neatly into her mailbox, always unsigned. Some printed, others handwritten in aggressive cursive. They referenced rules, community standards, concerns over property values. One suggested she present documentation of ownership to the homeowners board to clarify residency status. And another said, we prefer a quieter presence in this part of the neighborhood. Makinun. The language was always veiled, always polite, but the meaning was sharp and clear. Thomas Randy had been busy. He didn't approach her again directly. He didn't need to. Instead, he worked the way men like him always had, with whispers, with nods behind backs, with carefully cultivated doubt. He fed the idea that something was off about her presence, that she was a disruption, a question mark in a neighborhood that didn't like unanswered questions. A week later, she returned from a hike to find a landscaping crew trimming the bushes outside her fence line. She hadn't ordered service. As she stepped out of her car, one of the workers looked up awkwardly. Sorry, he said. We were told this property was vacant. By who? He hesitated. The guy across the street said the owner moved out, that someone else was just using the place. She stared at him until he looked away, then waved his crew back into the truck. That night, she sat on the edge of her pool, arms wrapped around her knees, her dog's head resting in her lap. The stillness pressed in around her like water soft, cold, and relentless. Her home, her sanctuary, was slowly becoming something else. A stage, a test, a trap. Inside, her phone vibrated with an alert. Another HOA notice. This one more formal. It cited continued concerns from multiple residents regarding unusual traffic and perceived disturbances. There was no fine, not yet, just a reminder, a warning. She deleted it. A few days later, while returning from the gym, she found a note taped to her garage door. The handwriting was the same aggressive cursive as before. Pretty car. Hope it's insured when they tow it. Rules are rules. No name, no signature. Just a threat dressed as a prediction. Rhonda peeled the note off carefully, folded it twice, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. That afternoon, she walked the neighborhood loop. A casual route she'd taken a dozen times before, only this time she saw the eyes. From behind curtains, across porches, through cracked open doors, watching her, gauging her. No one waved, no one spoke. She was no longer invisible. She was defined, labeled. And the label had spread like rot through perfectly painted walls. Thomas Randy had established his version of the story. And in places like this, a story repeated often enough became a kind of truth. Later that week, she returned from errands to find a patrol car idling at the end of her street. Not parked, not responding to a call, just waiting, watching. She approached slowly, groceries in hand. The officer inside glanced at her but said nothing. She entered her driveway and disappeared behind her gate without a word. The following morning, the patrol car was gone. But in its place was something else. A small sign posted at the edge of her front hedge. Neighborhood Watch Zone. Suspicious activity will be reported. Tonam, the sign hadn't been there yesterday, and it didn't match the official markers used elsewhere in the community. She left it there, not out of submission, but strategy. That evening, while watering the rosemary plants she'd placed along the side path, she saw Thomas again. He was by the fence pretending to adjust his sprinkler heads. His eyes, however, were locked on her. When she turned, expression flat, he didn't speak, just stared. Something in his stance had shifted. There was satisfaction there now. He believed he was winning, that his story was the one that mattered, that power lived in perception. Rhonda returned to her house without a word. Inside, she stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not out of vanity, out of calculation. She had been through worse, faced harder men, taken hits that would break most. But this was different. This wasn't about violence. It was about erosion, about being worn down slowly until she began to doubt herself. She wouldn't let it happen. The next day, she drove to the store and returned with more groceries than usual. She parked the Ferrari directly in front of her gate, left the engine running for a moment longer than necessary, let the sound of it echo through the cul-de-sac like a declaration. As she began unloading bags, Thomas emerged again, not sneaking this time, not pretending. He walked to the edge of his property, arms crossed, watching. Behind him, a neighbor watered her plants and glanced nervously in their direction. Across the street, someone adjusted a curtain. The air was heavy with something unspoken. Rhonda met his gaze briefly, then turned her back and continued unloading. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he stood there, as if waiting for something, as if summoning it. That night, the neighborhood was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before a strike, before the final move in a game he thought only he was playing. She sat by the pool again, staring into the dark water. The surface was still, but beneath it, pressure built. Her dog shifted beside her, ears twitching, sensing what she already knew. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Friday morning arrived with a heavy sky and the scent of dry heat already rising from the ground. The kind of morning that felt dense with unspoken tension, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Rhonda laced her running shoes in the foyer of her home, her fingers steady, her body calm. The neighborhood outside still held its veneer of perfection, but she knew, like a house with termites, it was hollowing from within. Her routine remained unchanged. She jogged the same circuit around the neighborhood, nodding to no one, earbuds silent today by choice. She wanted to hear everything: the shuffle of footsteps behind fences, the hiss of sprinklers, the clicks of locks turning where they didn't need to. She wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. The unease that had been planted in the first days after her arrival had grown into certainty. Something was coming. Back at home, she showered, dressed in a dark gray sports bra and black running shorts, and stepped barefoot onto the front patio to water the herbs. Her dog, Grace, lay in the shade with a twitching tail, eyes lazily scanning the street. Ghost, more alert, paced near the side gate, his movements tight and slow. The Ferrari was parked out front, its polished red body gleaming against the pale stone of the driveway. It was a beautiful, machine-aggressive, confident, unapologetically powerful. It didn't try to blend in. It didn't ask permission. That alone had made it a target. She didn't hear the sirens. There were none. Instead, it was the low, calculated crunch of tires on stone that made her look up. Two black and white patrol vehicles rolled silently up the street and came to a halt directly in front of her property. Their lights were off, but the message was unmistakable. Rhonda's eyes narrowed slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. She turned off the hose and stepped back into the house, watching through the sheer curtains as the driver's doors opened in near unison. 3 officers emerged, 2 in uniform, 1 in a plain charcoal shirt tucked into tactical pants. The plainclothes man moved first, with the brisk, casual confidence of someone used to getting compliance without question. The others followed close behind. They didn't go to the door. They didn't ring the bell. Instead, they moved along the outer edge of the property until they reached the unlocked side gate. Without a pause, they pushed through and entered the backyard as if they belonged there. Rhonda met them by the pool. She stood on the smooth stone, arms relaxed, 1 foot resting on the cool tile edge, the sun painting her shoulders gold. Her expression was unreadable, her breath even. Grace raised her head from under the pergola, and Ghost stood near the patio table, still and silent. The lead officer, tall, red-faced, buzzed hair, spoke first. He barked commands like he was on a drill field. "Hands where I can see them." Rhonda didn't move. The second officer stepped to her right, unsnapping his holster. His eyes were cautious but already primed for escalation. "You're trespassing," the third one said. "We received a report of an attempted vehicle theft. Description matches you exactly." Rhonda blinked once. Her Ferrari sat in the driveway, untouched, with the driver's door closed and the key fob on the patio table beside her phone. "I live here," she said, voice calm. "We'll need to verify that," the red-faced officer growled. "Now." She didn't step forward, didn't reach for anything. "I'm going to ask you again." He didn't finish. In 3 long strides, he was on her. His hand clamped onto her wrist, yanking her arm behind her back with rough force. She didn't resist, not yet. The second officer moved forward, reaching for the other wrist, and the third stepped to the side, hand still on his weapon. The metal cuffs snapped around one wrist before she spoke again. "This is my home," she said evenly. "That car is mine." The second cuff never closed, because the moment she felt the cold bite of steel on her skin, something inside her clicked. Not fear, not panic. clarity. The shift in her stance was imperceptible. A small weight transfer from heel to ball of foot, a rotation in the shoulder, years of muscle memory tucked into bone, waiting. The red-faced officer grunted as her body twisted beneath his grip. She ducked low, pivoted, and used the momentum of his grab against him. In a fluid motion, she flipped him over her hip and sent him sprawling to the stone beside the pool, his badge skidding across the tile. He hit the ground with a thud, stunned. The second officer reached for his taser, but she stepped in, knocking it from his hand before he could aim. She swept his legs from under him with one kick, sending him crashing onto his back. Wind knocked from his lungs. The plainclothes officer stood frozen, his hand hovering near his sidearm. He hadn't drawn it. Not yet. And now he hesitated. Ronda stood still. Two men lay on the ground behind her, one groaning, the other dazed. Her chest rose and fell, not with anger, but with precision. Every movement calculated, every choice measured. She raised her hands slowly, not in surrender, but in demonstration. You entered without a warrant. You touched me without cause. That's assault. The plainclothes officer's jaw clenched. His radio crackled at his side. Somewhere behind the hedge, someone watched. Across the street, Thomas Randy stood just behind the post of his front porch, phone in hand, smiling. Ronda turned to the side table and picked up her phone. She didn't call anyone. Not yet. She just held it in her hand and met the officer's gaze. Do you have any identification? He asked finally, voice low, strained. Ronda pointed to the house. Inside. He nodded stiffly, but she didn't move. Not until the two officers on the ground sat up, bruised and red-faced. Only then did she walk toward her front door, her dogs trailing behind her like sentinels. Inside, she retrieved her ID, her property deed, and her vehicle registration. All perfectly legal, all with her name on them. She returned to the patio and handed them over without comment. The plainclothes officer scanned them in silence. Finally, he said, "We'll need to speak with the reporting party." Ronda's eyes shifted back across the street. Thomas was gone. Coward. The officer cleared his throat and began to apologize in a fumbling, bureaucratic tone. She didn't respond. She didn't want their words. She wanted them to remember. The officers retreated slowly, carefully, no longer in control of the scene. The one who had cuffed her avoided her eyes. The other rubbed his shoulder, muttering something about protocol. They left the same way they came, quiet. No sirens, no lights. The gate clicked shut behind them. Ronda stood still on the patio for a long time after they left. The cuffs, now unlocked, lay on the table. Her wrists bore faint red marks, already fading. Her breathing returned to normal. Her hands stopped shaking. But inside her, the fire didn't fade. This had not been a mistake. It had been a choice by the neighbor, by the officers, by everyone who had decided she didn't belong. And now that choice had consequences. The air was different after they left. Not just quieter, but altered, like the drop in barometric pressure before a storm breaks open the sky. Ronda stood on the patio, unmoving, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the table where the handcuffs now sat in a coiled silver loop, inert and shameful. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stone, and the glint off the metal felt like a reminder, cold, impersonal, but precise. Grace curled beneath the pergola again, sensing that the threat had passed but not gone. Ghost lay with his chin on his paws, eyes toward the gate as if daring it to swing open again. Ronda didn't speak. There was no audience here, no camera flash or commentary, just breath, muscle, the familiar weight of discipline wrapping around her rib cage like armor. Inside, the house had not changed. The light was the same, the floor unmarred, her furniture unbothered. But something had shifted within its walls. The invasion had not been violent, but it had been absolute. Authority had walked in without knocking, gripped her without justification, spoken to her as if her own property were borrowed. There had been no proof, no evidence, no pause for verification, only assumption. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the island, staring into the stillness of her kitchen. The taste of adrenaline had faded, but something sharper remained. It wasn't anger. That would have been easier. It was the slow, crawling burn of violation, the sense that something sacred had been breached, not through force, but through presumption. Hours passed. She remained seated long after the sun had dipped behind the hills, watching the pool reflect the gathering night. Lights in neighboring homes flicked on, one by one. Curtains twitched. The neighborhood pulsed with low-level activity, but none of it approached her fence again. Thomas Randy had vanished back into his den of righteousness, no doubt drafting another letter, spinning a new justification, waiting for the next opportunity to reassert himself. Men like him didn't retreat. They regrouped. That thought stayed with her as she stood to stretch, as she turned off the kitchen light and moved through the house. She walked through each room slowly, checking doors, windows, sensors. It wasn't fear driving her, but instinct. Even a lion checks the perimeter of its cave after it's been disturbed. In her bedroom, she stripped off the sweat-stained clothes and stepped into the shower. The water was hot, but it did not scald. She stood beneath it with her eyes closed, letting it run over her face, down her back, over the faint bruises already blooming on her wrists. Her skin, trained by years of impact, would recover. It always did. But what lodged deeper, what bruised beneath the bone, was the idea that her presence alone had justified force. She stepped out, wrapped herself in a towel, and stood in the mirror. The woman who stared back was unchanged, no weaker, no smaller. But something in her expression had hardened, not broken set. The next morning came with a sky of pure, flat blue. Not a cloud, not a breeze. A still, judging kind of day. She dressed in loose black joggers and a tank top, hair tied in a simple knot at the base of her neck. She took her time preparing breakfast, moving with the mechanical calm of someone who had already made her decisions. When she finished, she stepped outside and placed the empty glass on the table beside the handcuffs. She did not touch them. Across the street, the Randy residence remained shuttered. Curtains drawn, no movement on the porch. But she knew he was inside, watching, calculating. Men like him always waited to see how much damage they'd done before deciding whether to escalate. Later that day, she received a call from a lawyer. Not hers yet. The firm represented residents of the neighborhood and had been forwarded complaints about her aggressive behavior by the HOA president. The voice on the other end was measured, careful, laced with the kind of insincere concern that dressed itself in legalese. Rhonda listened, said nothing, then hung up. She didn't call back. She didn't answer the follow-up emails. She let the silence settle like ash. That afternoon, she went to the garage and retrieved a pair of black boxing wraps from a drawer. She hadn't used them in months. Her fights were behind her now, officially at least. But as she sat on the mat in her personal gym, wrapping each hand with slow precision, the old rhythm returned. Over the knuckles, around the wrist, between each finger. Not for combat, for clarity. It wasn't the wrapping that mattered. It was the ritual, the declaration of readiness. When the sun began to set, she walked the neighborhood again, not out of necessity, but intention. She wore the same clothes, the same quiet expression. She passed the same neighbors, most of whom glanced away. Some nodded stiffly, none spoke. Thomas didn't appear. She stopped at the community bulletin board near the park entrance and stared at the newest notices, none of which concerned her. Yet, she returned home and found a second letter slid under her gate. This one was typed, anonymous, filled with veiled references to community safety and female volatility. She read it once, then dropped it in the trash. She made no response. She filed no complaint. She didn't speak at the next HOA meeting, but she waited. And on the third day, her silence paid off. A letter arrived. Not a complaint, not a summons, an apology. Typed on official HOA letterhead, signed by the board secretary. It acknowledged miscommunication regarding the incident with law enforcement and stated that the HOA did not, in fact, find any violations on her record. It made no mention of Thomas, no retractions, no restitution. But it was a beginning. Rhonda folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't need it, but she would keep it. The next day, she parked her Ferrari in the same spot-centered, unapologetic. She left it there while she trained, while she showered, while she stood barefoot on her back patio, sipping water as the dogs lounged in the sun. No officers came, no letters arrived, but she knew it was not over. That evening, she took a walk past Thomas's house. He stood at the edge of his porch this time, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. No phone, no recording. She met his gaze and held it. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The dogs flanked her like shadows, their bodies loose but ready. Rhonda paused in the street long enough to make it clear that she wasn't hiding, that she saw him, that she had seen everything. Then she turned and continued down the sidewalk, her steps even, her posture straight. She didn't look back. At home, she lit a candle on the patio and sat in silence as the sun bled into the Pacific. The house behind her glowed with the light of earned stillness. The road before her lay empty. Not safe, but quiet. For now. She sat there long into the night, feeling the weight of the moment settle not on her shoulders, but beneath her feet. Not a burden, a foundation. The final shift didn't arrive with sirens or confrontation. It came in the form of stillness, a different kind of quiet than what Rhonda had first sought when she moved into the neighborhood. This one didn't pretend to be peace. It was the silence left behind when something breaks and everyone watches to see if it will heal or rot. It was the hush of reckoning. Days passed after the last encounter. No further letters arrived. No patrol cars idled near the curb. But there was a palpable change in the atmosphere that made each breeze feel like it carried a witness. Neighbors who once looked through her or around her now offered cautious nods, sometimes even a murmured greeting, not warmth, respect, or perhaps fear. Thomas Randy, however, became a ghost. His house across the street remained sealed, its windows shuttered, its lights dimmed. His car no longer moved from the driveway. The American flag still fluttered from its post, but it hung limp and tired, as though even it had tired of standing on his behalf. He didn't come out to water the lawn. He didn't pace the sidewalk. He didn't appear at the HOA office hours or submit new letters. The man who had once policed her every movement had vanished into his own silence. Rhonda noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she didn't celebrate it. She knew what defeat looked like, and she knew the difference between justice and collapse. What had happened to him wasn't transformation. It was retreat. He had not changed. He had only been revealed, and the world around him had finally decided to look. She didn't need to finish him. He'd done that himself. What mattered now was what remained. The neighborhood began to move around her differently. A young couple 2 doors down left a handwritten note of apology in her mailbox. Small, careful words admitting that they'd believed the gossip because it had been easier than asking questions. They thanked her for holding her ground. Rhonda read the letter once and left it in the kitchen drawer, between a spare set of keys and a photo of her late dog. She didn't need the gesture, but she recognized the effort. Later that week, a retired teacher from the corner house stopped her on the street during her evening walk. She didn't say much, just a gentle smile, a nod, and a simple thank you. Then she went back to trimming her hedge. The women were the first to change. Always. Not long after, Rhonda saw a delivery man she recognized, one who had looked at her with suspicion a month earlier, now exchanging a quiet joke with her gardener. Small signs, small shifts. She watched them all, said little, and continued forward. In the early days of her move, she had hoped for anonymity. Now she understood that anonymity was a luxury rarely afforded to women like her, not just because of her name or her past, but because of the space she took up, the car she drove, the silence she kept. In a world where performance was often mistaken for safety, her stillness had become defiance. And then the final nail came, not from her hand, but from the county. A white SUV with county plates arrived one morning while she was training in the backyard. She heard the tires first, then the muted sound of conversation. She walked to the side gate, towel around her neck, sweat on her arms, and watched from a distance. 3 officials stood at Thomas Randy's front gate. 2 men, 1 woman. Suits, not uniforms. No sirens, no aggression. Just presence. The kind that speaks with documents and protocol. Thomas eventually emerged, disheveled, a beer can in one hand, his eyes sunken and unsure. The lead official handed him a thick envelope, gestured to it, and began explaining something. Rhonda couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the tone. Administrative, cold, final. His body sagged as he flipped through the papers. He tried to speak, gestured toward her house, but the officials remained unmoved. They pointed to the street cameras, to the phone records, to a list of dates and incidents. Then they stepped back and waited. Thomas looked up directly across the street. Their eyes met. There was no smugness in Rhonda's expression, no smile. She stood on her porch, towel in hand, her stance as neutral as the sunrise. He looked at her for a moment longer, then looked away. The agents departed. The SUV turned the corner and disappeared. Thomas sat on his steps for a long time after that. By the end of the week, moving boxes began to appear outside his house. Not in a rush, not dramatic, just the slow dismantling of a man's illusion of permanence. The neighbors didn't offer to help. The same people who once shook his hand and nodded along to his mutterings now crossed the street without comment. One man mowed his lawn deliberately, as if to pretend nothing was happening. Another watched from his porch, pretending to be on a call. Rhonda watched too, not from victory, but from responsibility. She knew now that this was bigger than Thomas. It always had been, because what had happened to her, the invasion, the assumption, the force, could have happened to anyone. And it had, for years, for generations, to people without money, without muscle, without cameras or credentials or control composure. She had endured it, but others might not have. So she began to act. She reached out to a legal nonprofit, quietly, without fanfare, asked questions, offered time, funds, introduced a plan for legal aid for women and marginalized homeowners targeted by HOA harassment, false police calls, or informal profiling. She didn't attach her name to the website. She didn't post about it. She just built it. Word spread, lawyers volunteered, advocates responded, stories poured in, nurses harassed over parking, single mothers questioned for walking into their own buildings, veterans profiled while moving into new homes. She read everyone. She didn't reply to them all, but she remembered them. In the months that followed, policy within the HOA began to shift. Training programs emerged, de-escalation, bias awareness, lawful complaint handling. New leadership was quietly elected after a wave of support-backed candidates aligned with transparency. And one evening, as Rhonda walked back from her run, she found a small group of teenagers standing near her driveway. They hesitated when they saw her. One of the girls, maybe 12 or 13, stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "Are you the one who took down the police?" Rhonda paused, then gave a small nod. The girl smiled. "I want to be like you." Rhonda looked at her for a long second. Then she knelt, her hands resting on her knees, eyes level with the girl's. "You'll be better," she said. The girl nodded like it was a vow, then turned and ran to catch up with her friends. That night, Rhonda sat by the pool again. The same chair, the same glass of water, the same dogs resting nearby. But the silence felt earned now, not forced, not fragile. She looked out over the horizon, the sky deepening to indigo, the wind curling through the trees. The house behind her glowed softly, no longer a refuge from the world, but a point of power within it. Across the street, the Randy house was dark, empty, the driveway bare. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a beginning. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out the next video and explore the rest of the channel. And share this one with someone who needs to see it.